In 1966 in Chicago, the Hallicrafters company, the undisputed king of American shortwave radio, was quietly sold. The name that had defined precision amateur radio for a generation was absorbed by a retail corporation, and shortly after, swallowed entirely by the aerospace giant Northrop. The heavy steel-cased receivers disappeared from electronics store shelves. Amateur radio operators lost their most trusted manufacturer. The glowing tuning dials vanished from basement workbenches. A legendary Chicago factory floor went silent, its immense industrial ambition traded away for corporate spreadsheets. 2 decades earlier, that exact same name had meant something entirely different. It had meant absolute survival, coordinating Allied communications across global battlefields with equipment that refused to fail. But the real story of Hallicrafters is not just the story of a military contractor being absorbed into the aerospace industry. It is the story of how the American hobby of shortwave listening and the complex tube radios that made it possible was dismantled by the transistor, the imported receiver, and a fundamental shift in how America tuned into the world. Every week, we tell the stories of American radios, local signals, and listening habits that once shaped how America heard the world and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in Chicago in 1932. In 1932, the American living room already had a voice. It was usually housed in a heavy wooden console, an AM radio, an amplitude modulation broadcast receiver that changed signal strength to carry sound over local and regional distances. That wooden box played network comedies, local news, and big band music. It was a domestic appliance, designed to look like furniture and sound like comfort. But there was a different kind of listening happening in America, and it was not taking place in the living room. It was happening in basements, in detached garages, in attic bedrooms, and in the small makeshift workshops known as shacks. These were the American amateur radio operators, the hams. They were not interested in the local network affiliate. They wanted to hear London. They wanted to hear ships navigating the Atlantic. They wanted to pick up experimental broadcasts from South America, and they wanted to communicate with each other across county and state lines. To do this, they needed to monitor shortwave, a broadcast band that can carry radio signals over enormous distances by bouncing them off the Earth's ionosphere to cross countries and continents. But in the early years of the Great Depression, the American shortwave listener faced a severe commercial void. The market was split into 2 extremes. On one end were cheap, rudimentary kits that required the user to wind their own coils and solder their own circuits. They were unreliable, drifted off frequency, and struggled to pull clear audio out of the static. On the other end were commercial, laboratory-grade communications receivers built by companies like National or RCA. These were magnificent machines, but they cost hundreds of dollars, an impossible sum for a working-class American in 1932, a year when the average monthly income was plummeting. There was no middle ground. The American radio market lacked a mass-produced, high-performance, affordable shortwave receiver. William J. Halligan saw the absence clearly. Halligan was a Boston-born former telegrapher and a veteran Navy radio operator. He was an active amateur radio enthusiast himself. He understood the exact psychology of the American hobbyist because he shared it. He knew that a serious listener did not want a piece of wooden furniture. They wanted an instrument. They wanted a radio receiver, a dedicated device that selects a specific broadcast signal from the air and turns it into sound, that looked and felt like professional communication gear. In late 1932, Halligan moved to Chicago, the undisputed center of American electronics manufacturing, to fill that void. He combined his name with the word crafters to form the Hallicrafters Company. Halligan had a brilliant product vision, but he had a significant problem. He did not own a factory. Furthermore, The Radio Corporation of America held an iron grip on the patent licensing required to build super heterodyne radio circuits. Instead of raising massive capital, Halligan leveraged the dense industrial ecosystem of Chicago. He contracted the Silver Marshall Manufacturing Company, which already held the necessary RCA licenses and had active assembly lines, to build his first designs. By outsourcing the physical assembly while tightly controlling the engineering and the branding, Hallicrafters brought its first models to the market. The strategy worked. By 1935, Hallicrafters was generating enough revenue to acquire its own manufacturing facilities and its own patent licenses. The company established its permanent headquarters in Chicago and began stamping its own metal cabinets. What rolled off the Chicago assembly lines was a revelation for the American radio enthusiast. A Hallicrafters receiver did not look like a living room radio. It was encased in heavy, ventilated steel. It was finished in dark, industrial wrinkle paint. The front panel was crowded with heavy Bakelite knobs, Bakelite being an early, hard plastic that was highly moldable, heat-resistant, and visually distinctive. At the center of the panel was the tuning dial, the illuminated scale or display that shows exactly which frequency the radio is tuned to. Behind that dial sat a massive tuning capacitor, a precision mechanical component that changes the circuit's electrical resonance so the radio can select one single station out of the crowded airwaves. Inside the steel cabinet sat rows of glass vacuum tubes, electronic devices used to control and amplify weak signals before the invention of the transistor. A Hallicrafter set ran hot. It smelled of warm dust, heated metal, and ozone. It felt serious. More importantly, it was priced for the American reality. While a professional lab receiver might cost $300, Hallicrafters introduced models like the Sky Buddy and the Sky Champion for roughly $40 to $50. The American reception was immediate and overwhelming. Hallicrafters did not sell these machines in local department stores next to vacuum cleaners and toasters. They utilized a highly specific retail channel. They sold through specialty electronics distributors, through local ham radio shops on Main Street, and heavily through mail-order catalogs like Chicago's Allied Radio Catalog. The brand dominated the pages of QST, the official magazine of the American Radio Relay League. Full-page ads detailed the technical specifications, the microvolt sensitivity, and the precise mechanical gearing of the dials. When an aspiring operator studied to pass the test for their FCC license, the strict government authorization allowing an individual to broadcast on a specific frequency under specific rules, a Hallicrafters receiver was the reward they dreamed of placing on their desk. By the late 1930s, Hallicrafters had effectively standardized the American amateur radio workbench. If you walked into a basement in Ohio, a garage in California, or an attic in upstate New York, and you heard the high-pitched squeal of Morse code or a voice fading in from London, the room was almost certainly lit by the warm, amber glow of a Hallicrafters dial. In 1940, the company released its pre-war masterpiece, the SX-28 Super Skyrider. It weighed 75 pounds. It utilized 15 vacuum tubes. It featured a massive gear-driven main tuning dial and a separate band spread dial for razor-sharp station selection. It was a mechanical and electrical triumph, costing roughly $160. Expensive, but still within reach for a dedicated hobbyist. William Halligan had achieved exactly what he set out to do. He had taken the high-end communications receiver, applied Chicago's mass production efficiency, and placed the world on the American workbench. Hallicrafters was the undisputed king of the civilian shortwave market. But the civilian market was about to vanish. The world that American listeners were tuning in to hear was descending into total war, and the United States military was about to realize that the radios they needed for the battlefield had already been perfected in a factory in Chicago. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, the American military faced an immediate crisis of communication. The battlefield was suddenly global. moving far faster than fixed telegraph wires could track. The U.S. Army Signal Corps needed a mobile, high-powered radio system that could be thrown into the back of a truck, driven across a North African desert or a frozen European field, and still transmit a clear, powerful voice back to command. They did not have years to design a new system from scratch. They looked to the American civilian market. Specifically, they looked at the Hallicrafters HT4, a high-end civilian transmitter, the specialized equipment that turns audio into a radio signal and sends it out through an antenna. Hallicrafters took their civilian engineering, militarized it, and created the legendary SCR-299. It was not just a radio, it was a complete, mobile communication station housed inside a heavy K-51 panel truck. It paired the Hallicrafters BC-610 transmitter with their precision military receivers. It was built to withstand the worst environmental conditions on Earth. The chassis were heavily reinforced. The vacuum tubes, the glass electronic devices used to control and amplify weak signals before the transistor era, were seated in heavy, shock-absorbing sockets, so they would not shatter when the truck hit a mortar crater or a deeply rutted road. The performance was staggering. General Dwight D. Eisenhower credited the SCR-299 with reorganizing American forces during the North African campaign. It provided the vital communications bridge at the invasion of Sicily and the landing at Normandy. Hallicrafters had taken the basement hobbyist's dream and turned it into the central nervous system of the American war effort. To meet the massive military demand, the Chicago factories expanded relentlessly, running 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, employing thousands of American workers, and earning the prestigious Army-Navy E Award for excellence in production. When the war ended in 1945, the American radio market had fundamentally changed. Millions of returning servicemen had seen, used, and trusted the Hallicrafters name under fire. It was no longer just a niche brand for dedicated amateur operators. It was a symbol of American mechanical triumph and absolute reliability. William Halligan recognized that this new, massive audience needed a radio they could actually fit into their homes. In 1946, Hallicrafters released a receiver that would redefine American shortwave culture for the next 2 decades, the Hallicrafters S-38. The S-38 was not a massive 75-pound piece of military hardware. It was a compact tabletop radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket. But it did not look like the wooden Zenith or Philco consoles sitting in American living rooms. It looked like a piece of serious industrial machinery. Styled by the legendary industrial designer Raymond Loewy, the S-38 featured a stamped steel cabinet painted in a sleek black wrinkle finish. The front face was dominated by 2 illuminated half-moon tuning dials, the specific visual scales that show exactly which frequency the radio is tuned to. One dial was for main tuning, and the other was for band spread, a secondary tuning control that mechanically gears down the dial, so the listener can make micro adjustments to separate 2 stations crowding the exact same frequency. The S-38 offered continuous frequency coverage. A listener could start on the standard AM radio band, amplitude modulation broadcasting, where the radio signal's strength changes to carry sound over local and regional distances, and listen to the local news or a baseball game. Then, with the heavy, satisfying snap of a rotary switch, they could change bands and move deep into the shortwave spectrum. Suddenly, the kitchen table was pulling in Morse code from marine vessels, aircraft weather beacons, time signals from the National Bureau of Standards, and propaganda broadcasts from Radio Moscow. It was a magical capability, and Hallicrafters priced it with ruthless brilliance. The S-38 launched at roughly $40. It was cheap enough that an American teenager could save up paper route money to buy one. It was affordable enough for a factory worker in Detroit to place on a garage repair bench. Because of its price and its battle-tested pedigree, the S-38 achieved a massive distribution breakthrough. You did not have to go to a specialized amateur radio dealer in a major city to find one. Hallicrafters receivers were heavily featured in the massive Sears, Roebuck, and Company mail order catalogs. They were stacked in the windows of Lafayette Radio in New York and Allied Radio in Chicago. They appeared in local hardware stores on Main Street and in the early, messy iterations of Radio Shack. The American radio moat that Hallicrafters built was practically unassailable in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Their competitive advantage was not a secret patent. It was the sheer manufacturing scale of their Chicago plants combined with uncompromised heavy-duty engineering. An imported knockoff or a cheaper private label catalog brand could not fake the heavy power transformers. They could not fake the chassis shielding, the physical metal barriers placed inside the cabinet that prevent electrical interference from ruining a weak signal. A Hallicrafters receiver possessed exceptional sensitivity, the ability of a radio to pick up incredibly faint, distant signals out of the atmospheric noise, and excellent selectivity, the ability to isolate that faint signal without interference from a powerful, local station operating right next to it on the dial. This was not marketing. It was physics housed inside a steel box. The American Radio Relay League endorsed them. High school science teachers requested them for their physics labs. Civil Air Patrol outposts relied on them for local emergency coordination. For a teenager looking at the glowing glass vacuum tubes through the perforated metal back of an S-38, the radio was an education in global geography, atmospheric conditions, and electrical engineering. When an American listener turned the heavy bakelite knob on a Hallicrafters receiver, they felt the mechanical resistance of precision gearing. They watched the dial string pull the heavy metal plates of the tuning capacitor, the exact physical component that stores electrical energy and changes the circuit's resonance to select one specific station. They heard the static part, and a voice from thousands of miles away stepped clearly into the room. The name on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. By the mid-1950s, the Hallicrafters manufacturing complex on West Fifth Avenue in Chicago was a roaring engine of American electronics. It spanned hundreds of thousands of square feet. It employed thousands of American workers, running massive assembly lines where rows of technicians hand-soldered point-to-point wiring, a labor-intensive construction method where individual electronic components are connected directly to each other or to terminal strips, rather than using a printed circuit board. The Cold War had turned the shortwave spectrum into a geopolitical theater, and Americans wanted a front-row seat. The average citizen did not just want to hear the local network affiliate playing popular music. They wanted to hear the BBC World Service from London, Radio Free Europe transmitting across the Iron Curtain, and the English-language propaganda broadcasts beaming out of Moscow. Hallicrafters provided the ear. The brand achieved a level of cultural and retail saturation that no other communications receiver manufacturer could match. If you opened a copy of Popular Electronics or CQ Amateur Radio magazine, the essential monthly reading for the American radio hobbyist and electronics experimenter, Hallicrafters owned the premium advertising space. Their receivers anchored the glossy pages of the Allied Radio catalog in Chicago and the Lafayette Radio catalog in New York. If you walked into Harrison Radio in Lower Manhattan, one of the premier electronics retailers in the country, the heaviest, most impressive metal cabinets on the display shelf carried the distinctive Hallicrafters H logo. This was the golden age of American shortwave DXing, the hobby of tuning in and identifying distant, weak radio signals from across the globe. The peak of this era was perfectly captured by receivers like the Hallicrafters SX99 and the massive 70-pound SX101. These were not disposable plastic boxes. They were architectural statements of industrial engineering. They featured large, illuminated slide rule dials, a wide, rectangular tuning scale where a physical pointer moves horizontally across printed frequencies. They incorporated an S-meter, a glowing analog gauge that physically measured and displayed the incoming signal strength, its needle swinging wildly as a faint transmission faded in and out of the atmospheric noise. These radios possessed extraordinary sensitivity, the ability to pick up incredibly faint signals, and sharp selectivity, the ability to isolate that specific faint signal without interference from a powerful local station broadcasting right next to it on the dial. For a teenager sitting in a dimly lit, unheated garage in Ohio in 1957, slowly turning the band spread dial on a Hallicrafters SX99 meant the difference between hearing a wall of atmospheric static and pulling a human voice out of the South Pacific. The radio was an anchor of trust in an uncertain era. During the height of the atomic age, the American Civil Defense Network relied heavily on amateur radio operators to maintain communications if telephone lines failed. Hallicrafters receivers were the backbone of these local emergency networks. Many consumer models were printed with the iconic Conelrad markings, the specific triangle symbols placed at 640 and 1,240 kilocycles on the AM radio dial, indicating the emergency broadcasting frequencies every American was instructed to tune to in the event of an attack. By 1959, the company was a titan. It was generating tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue. It was not just building shortwave receivers, it had expanded into AM/FM tabletop radios, clock radios, a small radio combined with an alarm clock often used beside a bed, and early black and white television sets. But the soul of the company remained in its heavy communications gear. A Hallicrafters receiver on a repair bench or a basement desk signaled that the operator was serious. It meant they valued heavy power transformers, rigid chassis shielding, and vacuum tubes that glowed orange in the dark. It meant they believed that American manufacturing could conquer distance. The American footprint of Hallicrafters in the early 1960s extended far beyond the Chicago city limits. It was a vertically integrated empire that touched nearly every facet of American electronic life. The distribution network was massive. Hallicrafters equipment was the centerpiece of the annual Burstein Appleby catalogs out of Kansas City and the thick Harrison radio catalogs in New York. On Main Street, local electronics shops proudly displayed the blue and silver Hallicrafters authorized dealer signs. This was an era when an American radio was not a disposable good. It was a capital investment. If a vacuum tube burned out or a capacitor, the electronic component that stores and releases electrical energy, failed, the owner did not throw the receiver away. They pulled the heavy chassis out of the steel cabinet, took the glass tubes down to the local hardware store to use the public tube tester, or carried the radio into a neighborhood repair shop. Hallicrafters supported this vast American service network with meticulously detailed schematic diagrams and readily available replacement parts. To own a high-end Hallicrafters was to hold status within the highly technical American amateur radio community. At massive regional gatherings known as hamfests, sprawling swap meets and conventions where operators traded equipment, bought surplus parts, and discussed antenna theory, a pristine Hallicrafters transmitter like the HT32 commanded absolute respect. The company was at the forefront of the American transition to single sideband, or SSB, a method of radio transmission that strips away the carrier wave and one sideband to use less frequency space and transmit voice far more efficiently than standard AM radio. Every summer, during the American Radio Relay League's annual Field Day, a national emergency preparedness exercise where amateur operators set up temporary stations in parks and fields, the blue-gray steel cabinets of Hallicrafters equipment dominated the folding tables. Operators ran heavy coaxial cables, thick shielded transmission lines used to connect the radio to the antenna, out to temporary broadcast towers. They powered the radios using portable gasoline generators. The equipment ran hot, it ran heavy, and it never failed. This engineering prowess was not cheap, but the American market eagerly paid for it. In 1961, Hallicrafters released the SX115, a receiver of such uncompromising mechanical and electrical quality that it cost nearly $600, equivalent to a significant down payment on an American home at the time. It featured a massive gear-driven tuning dial with triple conversion superheterodyne circuitry, a complex receiver design that mixes the incoming signal 3 separate times to achieve ultimate selectivity. It was a masterpiece of American industrial design, built for the serious listener who demanded to hear a whisper from across the Atlantic Ocean. If a severe Midwestern blizzard took down the telephone lines across rural Illinois in 1961, the state's emergency coordination did not rely on a standard plastic kitchen radio. It relied on a local amateur operator sitting in a freezing garage, trusting the heavy power transformer and glowing tubes of a Hallicrafters receiver to cut through the atmospheric static and call for help. That was the stakes of the brand. It was the absolute assurance of communication. Because of this reputation, the United States government remained Hallicrafters' largest and most vital customer. The company's aerospace and defense division was designing highly classified electronic countermeasures for the military. They built radar jamming equipment for the B-52 bomber. They designed sophisticated communication systems for the early American space program. By 1962, Hallicrafters employed over 3,000 workers across multiple manufacturing facilities in the Chicago area. The company's annual sales eclipsed $35 million, driven by a perfect synergy. The lucrative military contracts funded the advanced research and development, which then trickled down into the civilian shortwave receivers sold to the American public. At this moment, the American radio empire William Halligan built seemed invincible. The factory floors in Chicago were deafening with the sound of metal stamping presses. Thousands of soldering irons smoked on the assembly lines. Delivery trucks loaded with heavy, steel-cased receivers rolled out toward electronics retailers from California to Maine. The Hallicrafters name was etched into the dashboards of military bombers, the control desks of national emergency networks, and the repair benches of the most dedicated hobbyists in the country. They had conquered distance. They had conquered the American shortwave dial. But the technological foundation of that empire, the heavy, heat-producing, labor-intensive glass vacuum tube, was about to become obsolete, and the American radio market was preparing to reward an entirely different kind of listening. In 1966, the Hallicrafters Company reported some of the highest revenues in its history, driven largely by massive aerospace and defense contracts as the United States escalated its military involvement in Vietnam. But in the American consumer electronics market, top-line revenue can easily mask structural decay. The Chicago empire that William Halligan built was about to be dismantled by 3 overlapping market forces: the rising cost of American domestic manufacturing, a fundamental technological shift in how radios were built, and the aggressive arrival of high-quality imported receivers. For 30 years, the defining characteristic of a Hallicrafters radio was its sheer physical mass. The company built heavy iron. Their receivers relied on massive steel chassis, heavy iron core power transformers, and rows of glass vacuum tubes. Building these machines required hundreds of American workers on the Chicago assembly lines to engage in point-to-point wiring, a meticulous, labor-intensive construction method where a technician manually solders individual electronic components to terminal strips using physical lengths of wire. In the 1940s and 1950s, this was simply how high-performance radios were made. But by the mid-1960s, the technological landscape had shifted dramatically. The vacuum tube was being rapidly replaced by the transistor, a small, solid-state electronic component that controls or amplifies signals with a fraction of the heat, space, and electrical power required by a tube. Simultaneously, the manufacturing world was moving toward the printed circuit board, a flat, rigid board carrying small electronic components and copper tracks that automatically connect them, eliminating the need for hand wiring. To transition a massive legacy manufacturer like Hallicrafters from hand-wired vacuum tubes to printed circuit solid-state technology required a staggering amount of capital investment. The entire West Fifth Avenue plant in Chicago was physically and culturally organized around stamping heavy steel and soldering thick wires. Retooling those assembly lines for delicate, miniaturized transistors was an expensive proposition, especially when the cost of American union labor was steadily rising. This internal vulnerability was exposed by a sudden, fierce external pressure. In the mid-1960s, American electronics retailers, local radio shops, and mail-order catalogs began to feature a new kind of equipment. Japanese electronics manufacturers, such as Trio, which would later rebrand in America as Kenwood, and Yaesu, began importing amateur radio gear into the United States. Initially, American hobbyists dismissed these imports, loyal to domestic giants like Hallicrafters, Collins Radio, and National. But the imported radios quickly proved undeniable. They were utilizing modern solid-state designs. They were vastly lighter. They ran entirely cool, eliminating the thermal drift that caused older tube radios to slowly slide off frequency as they heated up. Most importantly, the Japanese imports capitalized on the transition to the transceiver, a single, unified piece of equipment that combines both a radio transmitter and a receiver in one cabinet, sharing the same tuning circuits to save space and cost. While Hallicrafters still sold massive separate transmitters and receivers that took up an entire basement desk and cost well over $1,000 combined, an imported Japanese transceiver offered the same capability in a box the size of a typewriter for a fraction of the American price. A dedicated amateur radio operator in a local electronics store no longer had to choose between an affordable, low-performing radio and a ruinously expensive American laboratory instrument. The imports offered high-end performance at a middle-class price. Hallicrafters, burdened by high domestic manufacturing costs and aging factory infrastructure, simply could not match the margins. Sensing the shifting winds, William Halligan, who was aging and looking to secure the financial future of his family, decided it was time to step away. In 1966, Hallicrafters was sold. It was not sold to a rival electronics giant like RCA, Zenith, or Motorola. In one of the most bizarre corporate transactions in American radio history, the Hallicrafters company was acquired by the Eckerd Corporation. Eckerd was a rapidly expanding, highly successful chain of American retail drugstores. They knew how to sell aspirin, cosmetics, and greeting cards. They knew absolutely nothing about military radio frequency engineering, shortwave propagation, or the specialized American amateur radio market. The acquisition was an attempt by Eckerd to diversify its corporate portfolio into the lucrative defense contracting sector, treating the legendary Chicago radio brand as a mere financial asset on a spreadsheet. The cultural clash was immediate and devastating. The executives in the drugstore business did not understand the civilian shortwave listener. They looked at the civilian radio division, the very soul of the Hallicrafters brand, and saw only a low-margin, high-overhead liability. Why maintain expensive Chicago assembly lines and specialized retail distribution networks to sell radios to hobbyists when the military division was generating millions in government aerospace contracts? Under Eckerd's ownership, the civilian product line began to stagnate. Research and development funding was quietly diverted away from the amateur radio division. While the Japanese competitors released wave after wave of sleek, fully solid-state transceivers with digital frequency displays, Hallicrafters continued to push heavy, hybrid radios that still relied partially on outdated vacuum tubes. The authorized dealer signs began to quietly disappear from Main Street radio shops. The prominent full-page advertisements in QST and Popular Electronics shrank. The American radio market, which had worshipped the Hallicrafters name for 3 decades, was inherently pragmatic. The listener did not care about corporate mergers or the legacy of Chicago manufacturing. They wanted a radio that stayed on frequency, fit on a desk, and did not empty their bank account. When Hallicrafters stopped providing that, the American buyer simply moved to a different brand. The Eckerd era proved to be a disaster, but the fatal blow to the Chicago factory had not yet arrived. By the dawn of the 1970s, the American shortwave and amateur radio market was unrecognizable from the era of the SX-28. The heavy, heat-producing vacuum tube was rapidly becoming an artifact. The Japanese competitors, Yaesu, Kenwood, and ICOM, were flooding American electronics stores with fully solid-state transceivers. These machines were compact, highly reliable, and aggressively priced. They utilized advanced printed circuit boards, flat, rigid boards carrying small electronic components and copper tracks that automatically connect them, that completely eliminated the expensive hand soldering required by older American manufacturing methods. The skilled American labor force in Chicago, who had spent decades mastering the meticulous point-to-point wiring of heavy iron chassis, suddenly found their expertise too expensive for the consumer market to support. This technological transition collided violently with the reality of American electronics retail. The massive mail-order giants like Allied Radio in Chicago and Lafayette Radio in New York were facing their own severe financial pressures in the early 1970s. They could no longer afford to allocate premium catalog pages or expensive retail floor space to slow-moving, heavy American tube gear that cost significantly more than the imported alternatives. The retail channel simply refused to support an outdated manufacturing model. Hallicrafters attempted a late counteroffensive. In 1972, under Eckerd's increasingly impatient ownership, the company released the FPM 300 Safari. It was a compact hybrid transceiver designed to compete with the imports. It used a combination of solid-state transistors for most circuits, while retaining a few vacuum tubes for the final power output stage. But the American market response was tepid. The radio lacked the meticulous, heavy-duty mechanical engineering that had defined the brand. The tuning dial did not feel as precise. The physical components felt lighter. The American operator, who had once viewed Hallicrafters as the absolute pinnacle of rugged reliability, now saw a company desperately trying to cut costs to catch up. Furthermore, the broader American listening culture was shifting. The golden age of shortwave DX-ing, the patient, late-night hobby of pulling distant voices out of global static, was losing its mainstream appeal. The Cold War paranoia that once drove Americans to monitor international broadcasts was fading into a new cultural era. Teenagers in the 1970s were not saving their paper route money to buy shortwave receivers. They were buying portable cassette players and tuning into local FM stereo stations, frequency modulation broadcasting that carried left and right audio channels for high-fidelity music. When Americans did want two-way communication, they bypassed the difficult FCC licensing exams and bought cheap, mass-produced Citizens Band, or CB radios, directly off the shelf at Radio Shack. The specialized amateur radio market was shrinking precisely as the competition within it became ruthless. Eckerd Corporation finally accepted the reality of the electronics market. The civilian radio division was bleeding money, and the defense contracts, while profitable, were entirely outside a drugstore chain's core competency. In 1975, Eckerd sold the entire Hallicrafters operation. The buyer was the Northrop Corporation, a massive American aerospace and defense contractor. Northrop was building advanced military aircraft, precision missile guidance systems, and sophisticated electronic warfare platforms. They looked at the Hallicrafters portfolio and saw immense value in the military division that built radar jammers for the B-52 bomber. they saw absolutely zero value in selling shortwave radios to hobbyists in Midwestern basements. To an aerospace giant, a consumer electronics division was an administrative nuisance with terrible profit margins. Northrop did not attempt to fix the civilian radio line. They did not try to compete with the Japanese imports. They simply applied corporate logic and severed the limb. Northrop systematically dismantled the civilian manufacturing operations. The extensive network of authorized Hallicrafters dealers across America received notice that no new inventory would be arriving. The warranty and service network, the essential shops, technicians, and repair counters that kept the radios working long after the sale, was abruptly cut off from factory support. The vast Chicago manufacturing footprint, which had once stamped the heavy steel cabinets and employed thousands of local workers, was repurposed entirely for classified defense contracting or sold off to developers. The name that had defined global communication for an entire generation of Americans was simply erased from the consumer market. The dealer network collapsed. The catalogs dropped the name. The Chicago assembly lines stopped. The civilian division closed. The retail shelves emptied. Northrop kept the military contracts. The factory floors were cleared. The glowing dials went dark. The American shortwave era ended. The Hallicrafters brand name did not immediately vanish from the earth after Northrop dismantled the Chicago Civilian Division in 1975, but it suffered a fate that many consider worse than a clean death: total brand dilution. For a brief period in the 1980s, the once proud name was licensed out, slapped onto cheap, generic imported walkie-talkies and low-grade consumer electronics. The brand that had once coordinated the Allied invasion of Europe and commanded the premium pages of American radio catalogs was reduced to a meaningless plastic badge. Eventually, even the licensing agreements expired. The corporate entity evaporated. But while the company disappeared from the commercial registry, the radios absolutely refused to die. Today, there is a massive, highly dedicated American preservation community that actively maintains the Hallicrafters legacy. If you walk through the crowded outdoor flea markets of the Dayton Hamvention in Ohio, the largest annual amateur radio gathering in the United States, you will not find people hunting for early internet streaming devices or vintage smart speakers. You will find them huddled over folding tables, inspecting the heavy steel cabinets of an SX-28 or an S-38. These machines are fiercely prized by antique radio collectors, amateur operators, and restoration experts across the country. An entire secondary market exists on platforms like eBay and specialized vintage radio forums, where enthusiasts trade new old stock vacuum tubes, original, unused glass electronic amplifiers manufactured decades ago, just to keep a Hallicrafters receiver glowing on their desk. On YouTube, American restoration engineers document the meticulous, hours-long process of bringing a silent SX-101 back to life. They replace dried-out electrolytic capacitors, the components that store and release electrical energy in a circuit, with modern equivalents. They rewire the heavy iron power transformers. They polish the bakelite knobs. They apply voltage slowly, watching the glass tubes warm up, smelling the distinctive mix of heated dust, hot metal, and rosin core solder that defines a vintage American radio chassis. The original Hallicrafters equipment still matters because it represents a radically different relationship between the American consumer and their electronics. Today, if a smartphone or a smart speaker, a connected device that plays audio through internet servers and voice commands, stops working, it is discarded. It is a sealed black box. A Hallicrafters receiver was the exact opposite. It was an open, repairable, strictly physical machine. It was designed under the assumption that the American owner was intelligent enough to read a schematic diagram, safely probe high-voltage circuits, and fix the equipment themselves. Furthermore, a smart speaker connects you to a localized server farm. A Hallicrafters receiver connected the listener directly to the physical world, relying on the ionosphere to bounce analog radio waves across oceans. It required patience, skill, and a fundamental understanding of atmospheric physics. It demanded something of the listener. The physical epicenter of that engineering, however, has been entirely erased. The sprawling Hallicrafters manufacturing plant at 4401 West Fifth Avenue in Chicago, which once ran 3 shifts a day to supply the United States military and the American hobbyist market, no longer produces electronics. The vast industrial ecosystem of Chicago's West Side has fundamentally transformed. The buildings that once housed rows of metal stamping presses and thousands of workers meticulously soldering point-to-point wiring have been demolished, repurposed, or absorbed into the modern urban landscape of light warehousing and parking lots. The roar of the American shortwave assembly line is completely silent. Yet, there is a surprising footnote to the Hallicrafters story that proves the sheer resilience of their engineering. While the civilian shortwave market was conquered by the transistor, the small, solid-state component that replaced the vacuum tube, the heavy military equipment Hallicrafters built during World War II achieved a strange kind of immortality. Decades after the war ended, American radio collectors and military historians in Europe and North Africa continued to unearth abandoned SCR-299 mobile communications trucks. In many cases, after sitting in barns or fields for 40 years, the heavy Hallicrafters transmitters inside those trucks required nothing more than a new power source and a basic cleaning to fire up and broadcast a perfectly clear signal. The machines simply outlasted the century that created them. The American consumer electronics market is structurally ruthless. It prioritizes convenience, cheap manufacturing, and mass adoption over heavy engineering and repairability. Hallicrafters built equipment for an American audience that valued absolute mechanical integrity and the magic of global reception. When domestic labor costs rose, when the printed circuit board changed the economics of manufacturing, and when the American public decided they no longer wanted to hunt for distant voices in the static, the company lost its foundation. They did not fail because their radios stopped working. They failed because the American listening culture moved on. Today, in a quiet basement in the American Midwest, an 80-year-old steel cabinet sits heavily on a workbench, its amber tuning dial glowing in the dark, pulling a faint, distant voice out of the winter sky. See you in the next one.